I need your bone marrow. It's the least you owe me. The words hung in the sterile beige air of the hospital consultation room, smelling of antiseptic and entitlement. My brother Mason lay propped against a pillow, looking wan and pale from the illness ravaging his body, but his eyes were the same they had always been, hard, calculating, and utterly convinced of his own importance. My parents stood on either side of his bed, nodding in solemn agreement, their faces masks of performative concern that didn't quite hide the glint of steel beneath. The room went dead silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed deafening. I could feel the starched fabric of my blouse against my skin, the cool leather of my purse strap in my hand. I had just come from my final pre-operative physical. I had signed the last of the consent forms. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. the next morning. In less than 12 hours, doctors were going to drill into my hip bone and extract the very essence of my life force to save his. And this was his response. Not thank you. Not I'm scared. Not I love you. A demand. An invoice. My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 27 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the family's designated fixer, the silent financier, the emotional shock absorber. They didn't know I was also the one keeping score. They thought I would just take it like I always had. They were wrong. If you've ever been treated like you don't matter by the very people who are supposed to love you most, if you've ever been the family ATM, the unpaid therapist, and the convenient scapegoat all rolled into one, then you know the feeling I'm talking about. It's a slow erosion of the soul. Hit that like button if you agree that respect is a two-way street and family is a title you have to earn every single day. My life with Mason was a long study in contrasts. He was the sun. I was the planet caught in his orbit, providing the gravitational pull that kept his chaotic world from flying apart. He was the artist, the dreamer, the one with so much potential that it absolved him of all responsibility. I was the practical one, the quiet one, the one who got a scholarship to a state university, studied data science because it was stable, and graduated with honors and a job offer paying 6 figures before I even had my diploma in hand. My success was never celebrated. It was monetized. It became the family slush fund, and Mason was its primary beneficiary. It started with his own college tuition. $34,000. He'd been accepted into a private arts college with a middling reputation, but an astronomical price tag. My parents, a teacher and a mid-level office manager, co-signed the loans with the blithe assumption that their brilliant son would graduate and become a world-famous musician, paying it all back in a flurry of Grammy-fueled gratitude. He dropped out after 3 semesters. The debt, however, remained. The calls from the loan agency started coming to my parents' house. The stress was giving my mother migraines, my father chest pains. So I did what I always did. I fixed it. I refinanced the loan into my name, set up an automatic payment plan from my new, healthy salary, and quietly began paying for a degree he never earned. It's just until he gets on his feet, honey, my mother had said, her hand patting mine, her eyes not quite meeting mine. You know how it is with artists. Their path isn't as straightforward as yours. My path. The one paved with 60-hour work weeks, meticulous budgeting, and the quiet sacrifice of my own dreams. I'd wanted to travel. I'd wanted to go to graduate school. Instead, I ate ramen noodles in my tiny apartment and watched a significant chunk of my income evaporate every month to pay for Mason's failed experiment in higher education. Then came the $67,000 music career. This was a multi-year investment in his ego. It started with a vanity album. $10,000 for studio time, producers who placated him, and session musicians who were paid to not laugh at his derivative lyrics. The album sold 43 copies, most of them to relatives I guilted into buying one. He wasn't deterred. He decided he needed to build his brand. This meant a new wardrobe of distressed leather jackets and designer boots, a top-of-the-line guitar he barely knew how to play, and a series of open mic nights where he would perform to an audience of 3 bored bartenders and me. I was expected to be there, every time, cheering the loudest. My applause was the fuel his fragile ego ran on. The money requests were relentless and always framed as emergencies. $2,500 for a promotional photo shoot. $5,000 to rent a van for a tour that consisted of him driving to 3 nearby cities and playing for gas money. Another $15,000 for a music video he directed himself, which looked like a blurry, self-indulgent student film, and garnered a whopping 200 views on YouTube, half of them from me trying to make the numbers look less pathetic. Every time I hesitated, every time I suggested a budget or a business plan, the family pressure machine would whir to life. "Ren, don't be so cold," my father would say, his voice thick with disappointment. "He's your brother. He's chasing his dream. You have a stable job, you can afford to help." "You're being dramatic," my mother would add. "It's not that much in the grand scheme of things. It's for family. The grand scheme of things." It felt like the grand scheme was for me to work myself to the bone to fund a fantasy life for a man-child who had never held a real job for more than a month. The bailouts were the most humiliating part. $41,000 in dribs and drabs, each one a testament to his utter lack of accountability. There was the $900 for the rent he was short on because he bought a vintage synthesizer. The $2,000 to get his car out of impound after it was towed for a mountain of unpaid parking tickets. The $6,000 to pay off a credit card he'd maxed out on networking dinners that were really just expensive nights out with his equally aimless friends. The worst was the $15,000 legal bill. He'd been arrested for public intoxication and vandalism after a drunken night out, and the family's good name was on the line. I got the call at 3 a.m, not from Mason, from my mother. "You have to fix this, Ren," she'd whispered, her voice frantic. "What will people think?" Not, "Is Mason okay?" Not, "What happened?" But "What will people think?" I paid the lawyer. I paid the fines. I paid for the damage to the storefront he had tried to kick in. Mason never apologized. He claimed it was a misunderstanding and that the police were targeting him for being an anti-establishment artist. My parents nodded along, accepting his fiction over the stark reality of the police report I had in my hand. Through all this, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself it was my duty as a daughter and a sister. I loved my family, or at least, I loved the idea of them, the one I held in my head from a childhood that seemed rosier in retrospect. I kept hoping that one day there would be a moment of reckoning. A day when they would turn to me and say, "Thank you, Ren. We see what you've done. We appreciate you." I was investing in that moment, pouring my money and my sanity into a future that would never arrive. It was the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. I had given so much, how could I stop now? Surely my return on investment was just around the corner. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in April. The air was crisp, full of the fall's promise of spring. My mother called me at work, her voice a thin, reedy thing I barely recognized. Mason had collapsed at home. He was in the hospital. It was serious, a plastic anemia. His bone marrow was failing. Without a transplant, he would die. The world tilted on its axis. All the resentment, the bitterness, the exhaustion, it all vanished, replaced by a primal, sickening fear. He was my brother. My infuriating, entitled, frustrating brother, but he was mine. The thought of losing him was unbearable. In that moment, I saw the crisis as a chance. A terrible, awful chance to reset everything. This was real. This was life and death. The petty squabbles over money, the artistic delusions, none of it mattered anymore. We would pull together. We would be a family. I would save him, and in doing so, maybe I could save us too. I was the first one to get tested. My parents were too old, their health too precarious. I walked into the testing center with a sense of grim purpose. I swabbed my cheek, filled out the paperwork, and told the coordinator to put a rush on it. For a week, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to work, I wrote code, I sat in meetings, but my mind was elsewhere, locked in a silent prayer. Let it be me. Let me be the one. The call came while I was grocery shopping. It was the transplant coordinator, a woman with a kind, calm voice. "Ren, we have your results. You're a perfect match. A 10 out of 10. I leaned against the dairy case, the cold seeping through my jacket, and I cried, not from sadness, but from overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. I could fix this. This was the one thing, the most important thing that I could finally, truly fix. I called my parents immediately. My mother's reaction was not the flood of grateful tears I had expected. It was a sigh of relief, but a strangely flat one. "Oh, thank God," she said. "Well, that's settled then. Of course you'll do it. You're his sister." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a foregone conclusion. My body, my time, my pain, it was all just another resource to be deployed for Mason's benefit. The first little crack appeared in my hopeful facade, but I papered it over. They were stressed. They were scared. I couldn't blame them for being blunt. The next few weeks were a blur of medical appointments, consultations, and blood tests. I learned about the procedure in excruciating detail, the powerful drugs I'd have to take, the deep, aching pain in my bones as my body was stimulated to overproduce marrow, the procedure itself, a large needle inserted into my pelvic bone repeatedly to draw out the liquid life, the recovery, which could take weeks. I didn't flinch. I read every pamphlet. I asked intelligent questions. I arranged for time off from work, assuring my boss I would be available remotely as soon as I could sit up comfortably. I was methodical. I was prepared. I was going to save my brother's life. The day before the surgery, they wanted us all at the hospital for a final consultation and to sign the last of the paperwork. We gathered in that beige room, the one that would become the backdrop for the end of my life as I knew it. Mason was in the bed, hooked up to an IV. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, and for a moment my heart ached with a fierce protective love. My parents stood beside him, their hands resting on the bed rail like sentinels. The mood was tense. I expected nerves, maybe even some heartfelt words. What I got was an ambush. "Ren," Mason started, his voice raspy but firm. "We need to talk about something before tomorrow." I sat down, assuming it was about his fears. "Of course, Mace. Anything." He exchanged a look with my parents. It was a planned, rehearsed look. My stomach went cold. "This whole thing," he said, gesturing to his own body, "it's been a real wake-up call. When I get through this, I need a fresh start. A real one. No more struggling." My father cleared his throat. "What your brother's saying, Ren, is that he needs to feel secure about his future. The stress of financial instability could cause a relapse. The doctor said he needs a stress-free environment to recover." I stared at them, my mind struggling to connect the dots. "Okay, so what does that have to do with me?" And that's when he said it. The line that severed 27 years of history. "I need your bone marrow," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, devoid of any warmth. "It's the least you owe me, but I also need $150,000 to set me up. An apartment, a new studio, living expenses for the first year, so I can focus on my recovery and my art." I just stared. I couldn't form words. The air left the room. My brain was a blue screen of death, an error message flashing over and over. "Does not compute, does not compute." My mother, seeing my stunned silence, jumped in to soften the blow, which only made it worse. "Think of it as an investment in his health, honey. A gift. You do so well for yourself. It wouldn't be a hardship for you, and it would give him the peace of mind he needs to heal." A hardship. $150,000. On top of the $142,000 I had already poured into his black hole of a life, and they weren't asking, they were telling. This was a condition of his acceptance. He wouldn't allow the donation otherwise. He was holding his own life hostage, and I was being asked to pay the ransom. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a clean, quiet break, like a pane of glass hit with a specific frequency, shattering into a million pieces. The years of resentment, the swallowed anger, the quiet humiliation, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, diamond-hard clarity. They didn't see me. They had never seen me. I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was a utility. I was a walking, talking bank account with a compatible immune system, a collection of spare parts and liquid assets, and in that moment, my love for them, which I had guarded and nurtured for so long, simply died. It withered on the vine and turned to dust. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I stood up. My hands were perfectly steady. My voice, when it came out, was calm and even, a stranger's voice in my own throat. "No," I said. The room was utterly still. It was as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Mason's face contorted, first in confusion, then in rage. What do you mean, no? Ren, don't be a bitch. My life is on the line. You're being dramatic, my father blustered, falling back on his old, tired script. This isn't the time for games. I said no, I repeated, my gaze sweeping over their 3 shocked faces. The financial arrangement you've proposed is not acceptable. Therefore, I am no longer a viable donor. I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't run. I walked down the long, sterile hallway, my footsteps echoing. I could hear them starting to shout behind me, a cacophony of disbelief and fury. I didn't look back. I took out my phone, my fingers moving with detached precision, and found the number for the transplant coordinator. Hi, this is Ren Calloway, I said, my voice as placid as a frozen lake. I'm calling to withdraw my consent for the bone marrow donation scheduled for tomorrow morning. There has been an unforeseen complication. Yes, I'm sure. Thank you. I hung up before she could ask questions. I walked out of the hospital into the cold night air. It felt sharp and clean in my lungs, the first clean breath I'd taken in years. The war was over. I had just surrendered, but somehow it felt like a victory. My phone began to explode. A barrage of calls and texts. My father, my mother, Mason. Their messages shifted from confusion to anger, to threats, to desperate pleading. You're killing your brother. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Ren, please, we can talk about the money. Just call us back. I didn't answer. I drove home, the city lights blurring past my window. I felt strangely empty, but it was a peaceful emptiness, the absence of a great weight. When I got to my apartment, I saw I had a notification from my credit monitoring service, a routine alert. I almost ignored it, but something made me click it open. Fraud alert. A new line of credit has been opened in your name. Address on file, 123 Oak Street, 123 Oak Street, my parents' house. The cold clarity I'd felt in the hospital sharpened into a blade. I sat down at my computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I logged into my credit report, and there it was. Not just one new account, dozens. Personal loans, high-limit credit cards, store cards, all opened within the last 6 months, all using my name, my social security number, my sterling credit score. The mailing address for every single one had been changed to my parents' home, so I would never see the statements. The total was staggering, $212,000. He hadn't just been planning to extort me. He had already been robbing me blind for months, and my parents had to have known. There was no other way. The mail, the calls. They weren't just enabling him, they were accomplices. The demand for $150,000 wasn't a desperate plea. It was the next logical step in their long-term project of stripping me for parts. I started printing. Every fraudulent application, every statement, every late notice that had been rerouted. I built a file, a thick manila folder full of their betrayal. It took me 3 hours. When I was done, the sun was starting to rise on the morning I was supposed to have been saving his life. Instead, I was documenting how he had been systematically destroying mine. I went to their house later that day. I knew they'd be there, stewing in their rage and fear. I knocked on the door. My father wrenched it open, his face purple with fury. There you are, he bellowed. Do you have any idea what you've done? They've taken him off the active transplant list. You have to call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. Let her in, Mark. My mother's voice trembled from behind him. She was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Mason was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking murderous. I walked past them and went to the dining room table, the site of so many tense family dinners where my contributions were ignored and my worth was questioned. I placed the folder on the polished wood surface. What's this? My mother asked, her voice wary. This, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, is $212,000 of debt. Debt that was taken out in my name, without my knowledge or consent. I opened the folder and spread the papers out like a losing hand of cards. The silence that fell was heavier, more profound than the one in the hospital room. It was the silence of the guilty. My father's face went from purple to a pasty gray. My mother put a hand to her mouth, a small, pathetic gesture of shock that I knew was a lie. Mason just stared at the papers, his jaw tight. We can explain, my father stammered, his bravado gone. No, you can't, I said. but you will. To the police. That's when the chaos erupted. It was exactly as I had pictured. My mother started sobbing, collapsing into a chair. Ren, no, you can't. We're family. It would destroy us. Think about your brother. Mason shot up from the couch. You bitch! He screamed, his face a mask of pure hatred. You were going to let me die over some stupid money? After everything I've been through? My father tried a different tactic, the booming voice of patriarchal authority. You will not do this, Ren. You will not bring shame on this family. We will pay it back. Just give us time. I let them exhaust themselves. I stood there and watched the performance, feeling nothing but a distant, clinical pity. They were like actors in a play, running through their tired, predictable lines. When they finally wound down, panting and hysterical, I looked at my mother. You want me to fix this? I said. It wasn't a question. You want me to call the hospital, reinstate the donation, and forget this all happened? She nodded desperately, tears streaming down her face. Yes, honey, yes. We can fix this. Just apologize to your brother. His health is the most important thing. There it was. The apology test. The final damning piece of evidence. I held her gaze. Where's his apology to me? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Where's the apology for the theft? For the fraud? For trying to extort a dying man's ransom from me? Where's your apology, Mom? For knowing? For letting him do this? Her mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. My father looked away. And Mason? Mason just sneered. Apologize to you? He spat. You have everything. I have nothing. You owe me. It's easier when people show you who they are. You just have to be willing to see it. I picked up the folder. I have my answer, I said. I walked to the door. If you walk out that door, you are no longer our daughter, my father threatened, his last pathetic gambit. You haven't treated me like a daughter in a decade, I replied without turning around. You've treated me like a line of credit, and it has just been declined. The door closed softly behind me. No slam, just the quiet click of the lock. The next day, I walked into the local police station with my folder of evidence and a sworn affidavit. The detective who took my case was a tired-looking man in his 50s. He listened to my story patiently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he looked through the paperwork, his eyebrows rising slightly. This is comprehensive, he said. Signatures, account numbers, IP addresses from the online applications. You're a data scientist, you said? Yes, I said. I traced the digital signatures. They all originated from the IP address at my parents' house. He nodded slowly. Ma'am, identity theft is a serious crime, especially on this scale. Are you sure you want to proceed? This is your family. They stopped being my family yesterday in a hospital room, I said. I'm sure. The investigation was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, a digital and paper trail that Mason and my parents had been too arrogant and too sloppy to cover up. They were arrested 2 weeks later. The neighbors watched as my brother was led out of the house in handcuffs. The shame my parents had been so desperate to avoid was now front-page news in our small suburban town. The aftermath was a long, methodical process of extraction. I blocked their numbers. I hired a lawyer to handle all communication. I spent hours on the phone with fraud departments from over a dozen different banks. I put freezes on my credit, changed all my passwords, and installed a security system in my apartment. I was building a fortress, brick by methodical brick. The legal process dragged on for months. My parents liquidated their retirement accounts to pay for Mason's defense. His lawyers tried to paint me as a vindictive, scorned sister, a liar who was jealous of her brother's artistic talent. But the evidence didn't lie. The signatures were forged. The money was gone. The IP addresses were irrefutable. Mason was convicted on multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and felony fraud. The judge was not moved by his lawyer's portrayal of him as a struggling artist. He saw a predator who had systematically exploited his own sister for hundreds of thousands of dollars and then tried to extort her for life-saving medical care. He was sentenced to 3 years in a state penitentiary. His medical situation sealed his fate. The criminal conviction, combined with his documented non-compliance, the attempt to sell his consent for the transplant, got him permanently blacklisted from the National Registry. No transplant center would touch him. He had become too high risk, a liability. He had made his choice in that hospital room, and the consequences were now absolute. My parents were ruined. The legal fees, coupled with the restitution I was awarded by the court, wiped them out. They had to sell the house I grew up in, the one filled with photos of a happy family that was only ever a carefully curated fiction. They moved into a small rental apartment in a neighboring town. I heard from a cousin that they rarely go out. The weight of the public shame was too much for them. I never celebrated their downfall. There was no joy in it. When I heard the verdict, I felt a quiet, somber finality. It was the closing of a painful chapter. Their ruin wasn't my victory. It was the consequence of their own choices, a debt that had finally come due. It's been 2 years now. My life is quiet. The quiet is the first thing I noticed. No more frantic phone calls demanding money. No more passive-aggressive texts. No more drama-filled holiday dinners. Just peace. A deep, resonant peace that fills my apartment like sunlight. The money I'm no longer hemorrhaging has grown into a formidable savings account. I took a month off last year and traveled through Southeast Asia. I sent postcards to no one. I stood on an ancient temple at sunrise and felt, for the first time, completely and utterly free. I am paying for my own graduate school now, an MBA program I'm taking online at night. I am investing in myself, for the first time in my life. Sometimes a new memory from the past will surface, a fresh angle on an old wound, and I'll feel a faint phantom pain, but it passes. It's like a scar from a major surgery. You never forget the injury, but the ache dulls over time, and you learn to live with the new landscape of your own skin. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. It doesn't guarantee love. It just makes the betrayal cut that much deeper. You learn that family isn't just about who you share DNA with. It's about who shows up, who respects you, who values you as a person, not an asset. Respect is earned, not owed. And sometimes the most powerful act of love is self-love. It's having the courage to amputate the toxic limb, no matter how much it hurts, to save the rest of the body. I chose me, and I have never, not for 1 second, looked back.